Barrier Island. You can see this little this map here. Um, and this map is possibly this is actually accurate again, perhaps. In the history of the island, as the sand regimes on the Cape have changed, it has been connected to the mainland, disconnected to the mainland, three islands, two island. At a certain point, it was connected to Morris Island, and Morris Island was actually an island. But in its current state, it's two islands plus Monomoy, and it's no longer connected to the mainland, although it was 8 years ago. And as you can see, when you get down near the tip of it, it bulges out, and there's a number of ponds there. They're hard to see. It's lighthouse, big station, little station, all these ponds. So what it is the rest of the island is just sand and dunes and sand and dunes. It provides maybe a little habitat for some shorebirds. It's a good place for nesting terns, as there's a video here playing of their at their colony where there's 12,000 pairs of them. But as far as most birds go, there's just nothing there to offer them. So they end up at the south end of the island where there's all these ponds. The history of the island is it's currently a wildlife refuge with researchers and sun stuff and nature things. But historically, it has been about maritime. So the lighthouse itself, the current lighthouse and the current lighthouse keeper's quarters are 170 years old. So the lighthouse that's pictured and the house that's pictured in the photo on the top right is the same lighthouse and the same house that's there today. Pretty amazing. There were light saving stations, two of them on South Monomoy. So these were the surfmen. One of them was by Powder Hole. The other one was farther up from the lighthouse. And these men every night just walk up and down the beach looking for floundering ships. And this was the history of it for years and years and years. There were horrible tragedies and great events. There was a town at the end, Whitewash Village. And luckily, we actually know a lot of the history of the island because there was a man named Giddings Ballou who worked for Harper's Bazaar, which was the most popular publication at the time. And he spent several years living at Whitewash Village, writing about life on the south end of the island, which is pretty amazing when you have this slice of life written by a professional writer in the biggest publication of the time. So we actually end up knowing more about life at Whitewash Village than many other more populated places. But the island has caught everybody is entranced with that island. Thoreau in his book Cod writes about it. Roger Torrey Peterson, the father modern bird watching, who came up with the identification guide, writes the intro to birds of cod and specifically talks about the best trips were trips down in the buggies to the end South Monomoy. So it's always kind of captured people's imaginations. And after it was the lighthouse saving stations, and then modern boating became differently, and we didn't need the stations and they didn't need the lighthouse. So eventually it just became kind of unused land, and there were a bunch of hunting cabins out there, just like you see on the Barrier Island off of Chatham. Well, you did until they all went into the ocean. And then eventually the wildlife refuge, it became a wildlife refuge. And from there, it's just become a place of research and conservation. So now there are researchers on the island maybe 10 months out of the year. So in the summer, it's common terns and piping plovers. As I said, there are 12,000 pairs of common terns in that colony, so 24,000 adults. And they monitor that colony every year. Piping plovers, we all know about the piping plovers on Cape Cod, and like in Chatham, they have some on Harding's Beach, and there's two pairs there, and we're really proud of those birds, and we do everything we can do to protect them. And there's about 30 pairs of those on South Monomoy, so it's an incredibly valuable, protected place for them. The seals, this is where the seals, one of the places the seals pup. So there's actually seal researchers down there in the winter working with the seal pups. In the summer, most of the time we see the seals, I see them bobbing around in the water, and I'm just hoping that a shark's going to come up and get them. But the researchers have something else going on with those. I don't know if you've seen these little guys in the middle bottom here. That's the northeastern beach tiger beetle. So this used to be a widespread beach beetle, and it pretty much is reduced to a small population on the Chesapeake. So they brought him over to South Monomoy to try to see if they could survive and reproduce there. They were never native to there, but it was the one protected beach left they could think of it. And it's been going on for about 10 years. And with the exponential growth, it didn't look like it was going that well. They're like, oh, we're seeing a few, we're seeing a few, we're seeing a few. Last year, there were just thousands and thousands and thousands of these things everywhere. So it's been a real success story. And you can see them if you go out there and walk on the outer beach. You just walk along the high tide line and look for some little thing that looks like a fly, about a half an inch long. It's these cool little beetles. And then, of course, bird migration, which is what we're interested in. Um, it's a really great migrant trap. It's also at this incredible geographic location. I'll touch on that soon. So migration monitoring. How do we actually do this? So there's two ways that we do migration monitoring. The first one is through bird banding, which we'll talk about a lot more, but we essentially set up these nets in the bottom left corner here. You can see this blackpoll warbler that was captured in a net. I don't know what happened to the quality of that photo, but it is in a very fine net that looks like spider web mesh. And then we put a band on them. Each band is a unique number. So every bird that's banded in North America gets their bands from the same location. So the 9-digit number that's on that bird is the only bird that has that 9-digit number. So you actually have to have the bird in the hand. This isn't a transmit or anything. But if this bird flies down to Central America and someone captures it and looks up the band, they'll be able to know exactly where we banded it. I actually got an email the other 2 days ago from the bird banding lab, an indigo bunting that we had banded or that we had captured on Monomoy in the fall was originally banded in Montreal at the bird banding station I used to work in up here. So that was pretty cool. We catch maybe 1 to 2 indigo buntings a year, and this one was from someplace else. The one that's pictured in this photo was actually when I was banding in Israel, and that bird was banded in Lebanon. It's a common reed warbler. And we could see Lebanon from the banding station, like the mountains were right there. But Israel and Lebanon are not on good terms. So we had to talk to the English man I was working with, and then he emailed his compatriots in England, and then they emailed the people in Lebanon, and then we got the history of the band that was actually a bird that was banded 50 miles away from where we were. But over there, it was always cool. You get a band, it says like Athens on it. But we do, so you get the band on there. There's a measuring of the tarsus. We try to get the age of the birds. And then the other more classic migration monitoring is what you see in the top right. Somebody with the scope, somebody with the clipboard, and we just count every bird we see. This is a survey of Powder Hole. Tide looks a little high for a survey, but so why South Monomoy? These 3 images really try to illustrate that. So if we look at the large image on the left here, I've got 3 different colors, and it does impact each bird end up at Monomoy for a slightly different reason. So when we look at the map, we generally think of Cape Cod as being really far east. But if you take the Atlantic provinces into account, there is a whole lot of land north and east of Cape Cod. You got all of Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Labrador, a whole chunk of Quebec. So all those birds, if they're migrating south, actually come through Cape Cod. They don't have to go out of their way to get here. And then the shorebirds. So shorebirds tend to breed in the northern tundra. It's the way their breeding system works. They can't stay on the beach. Piping plovers are an extraordinary shorebird that is actually able to raise their young on the beach. Almost all the other shorebirds go to the tundra have their young up there, and then come back to the beaches, because the beaches aren't safe. A little teeny little plover running around, they get munched. There's not any way for them to survive. So they all breed up in the tundra. And if those birds are coming from in the Gulf, the this the bay up here, whatever it's called, or the Great Lakes, or the St. Lawrence here along this yellow line, that's actually the shortest distance to the coast from any of those locations, is to come right to Cape Cod. So they breed and then they come right down to the Cape, which actually the shortest distance. Now the sea ducks, these are things like scoters and um, eider and the brant to a lesser extent. So a lot of those birds, they breed along the interior coast, and then they go and replace all their feathers on these offshore islands. But then when they migrate south, if they're following the actual coast, the far right yellow line, that brings them right to the Cape. And these are not deep ocean birds. These are birds that have to dive to the bottom to grab mussels. Now they can dive at amazing 200 feet down, but they're not going to be out over the edge of the continental shelf. And then the other line here that shows the yellow curving, this is birds migrating down the St. Lawrence Seaway. And those birds will migrate down the St. Lawrence Seaway. And then the shortest point, if they want to jump across, brings them right to Cape Cod. And then the final group of birds we get are the marsh ducks. So these are your freshwater ducks, things like black ducks and mallards and gadwall and widgeon and those things. And they actually winter on South Monomoy. They're beautiful protected ponds. It's warm enough there where everything doesn't freeze. This is actually a really prime wintering area for those species. So more about, go back here. So that's the big reason why all these birds kind of end up here in a continent wide. But if you look at the smaller inset map, we have why they end up there on the Cape. So we're on Monomoy in the fall. So these birds are heading south, going from north to south. And if they're on any place on the outer Cape and they just kind of head south, they're going to end up on the tip of South Monomoy, and then they're going to hit water, and they're not going to want to continue going. If there's a northwest wind, which is the prime migration wind in the fall, especially for people on the Cape, anybody that's up around Plymouth or on the mainland are going to get pushed in that northwest direction and end up on South Monomoy. And there are a few things about the way these birds behave that really does make it a migrant trap. When we're talking about songbirds, they don't like crossing water. They'll avoid it, and they certainly will not cross water to some place if they don't know there's land past it. So you're like, oh, why don't they just jump over to Nantucket? Because they can't see it and they don't trust it. And if they run out of energy, they're toast. So what happens is when they get pushed south, they'll follow the land, they'll follow the beach, they'll follow the land, they'll stay out off of the water, and then they just get funneled into South Monomoy. And then once they get down there, we got the only trees and fresh water around. So if they want to find food or any kind of forest that reminds them anything about where they're coming from, we're the only game in town. But it really is this like funneling effect. So the 4 different surveys that we do, there are 4 specialized counts, each one designed to best capture the individual type of bird we're censusing. So the first one is the dot right here that says Monomoy Refuge Banding Station. So that's where the banding station is. It's right around the lighthouse. There's maybe 50 conifers on the south edge of the island, and 47 of them are around the lighthouse. So that's where we have the banding station. It's also convenient because it's also where the bathroom is and the kitchen is. And that's one of them. The other one is Powder Hole on the left side here. So that's a mud flat, a tidal mud flat. So that's where we go to see the shorebirds. It brings in the water, it floods, that brings in nutrients, the water goes out, all the invertebrates living in the sand, the shorebirds come and feed on those. It's a really good migration spot. The next one is Lighthouse Beach, which is on the far right, to the right of the lighthouse there. That is the site where we look out over the Atlantic and count sea ducks and sea birds and things like that. We stand on top of a dune and then just look out into the endless expanse. That is what's known as a sea watch count. So we stay there for a certain amount of time and count every bird that flies by. And then the marsh duck is a traveling count. So for the marsh ducks, this trail's a little bit off, but we essentially start at the lighthouse and then we follow this line and count all the birds and all these little ponds as we get down. And then we cut over and go over to Big Station and count all the birds there. So it's a walking count. We walk from spot to spot because the ducks are could be on any of these different ponds depending on water levels. So we walk the entire thing and count every duck. So our research, the history of the entire station, it was founded in 2011. I was working at the University of Rhode Island at their banding station. And I mentioned to the professor that I was working with the geography of South Monomoy and my connection to the place and how it's just like, it's amazing. Nobody bans birds down there. And he's like, well, the biologist at the head of the region and the biologist at the refuge were both my students. So I could set up a meeting with you. And I approached them and they're like, oh man, it just would be great. We haven't had anybody down there since the 70s. They really just had no idea what was going on down there as far as songbirds. The refuge does a wonderful job, but they have very limited resources and they're worried about the terns and the plovers, not the migrating songbirds. So we founded it in 2011. We run each fall from August 15th to October 31st, trying to capture the majority of songbird migration in the fall. There's always two researchers on site. They live in the house, they band together, and then every 20 days we'll do a switch. So one team will be out for 20 days, they'll switch off, and the other team will go out for 20 days. And then the team that leaves the island will go run the Wellfleet station on the mainland. But those are good long stretches on the island, longer stretches than any of the other projects do, from what I understand. And then the banding and the census daily. So every morning we wake up before dawn and band for 6 hours, and then we go to another location and do census. So how do we actually do the bird banding? We capture the birds in these things called mist nets. You can see one on the right here. That tree swallow is not following proper mist net technique. It's supposed to fly into the mesh, not perch on the trammel. But we like that bird, so we use this photo. But if you look on the top there, second photo from the right, that's what they look like when they fly into the net. The net has a lot of this it's 18 or 12 meters long, 3 meters tall, and it's got a lot of extra netting. So when the birds fly in, the netting actually pushes out and they gently fall into it. And then when we come along, we check the nets every 40 minutes to make sure the birds aren't in there too long. We pull them out, process them, take them all back to the station, process them quickly. They get their band, they get their measurements, and then they're on their way unharmed. So again, these require a certain amount of cover. It's really windy on South Monomoy a lot of times, so we're tucked into the trees. That's where the birds are. You can see that in this photo a little bit. The birds are banded and measured and aged. So each bird gets their unique band. We measure the wing chord, the amount of fat the bird is holding. The amount of fat is based upon migration. Birds use fat in a very different way than mammals do. They can double their weight in fat in a week and then burn it off by flying for 2 days nonstop. So the one that's actually in the net there, that's a blackpoll warbler. Those birds will go from 12 grams to 24 grams, and then they'll fly 5 days nonstop from Cape Cod to Venezuela, and they will burn off all of that fat. But it's a short-term energy storage thing. It's not like mammals where you build up fat to survive the winter. They build it up during migration. So if they have a lot of fat, it says something about the bird's migration status and as well as how well it's actually doing on migration. And we age the birds. I don't have any pictures of this because it's really hard to see, but essentially the birds replace their feathers every single year, and the adult birds will replace every feather on their body every fall. but the young birds only replace half of their feathers. So we're able to look at the feathers of the bird and determine the age, but only if they were hatched this year or the year before, which is actually itself extremely valuable, because the proportion of young birds tells us how well they're breeding. Again, these blackpoll warblers here, they're breeding this rose-breasted grosbeak that's pictured here, even this red-breasted nuthatch, which do breed on the Cape, but the majority of these birds are breeding in northern Canada, where it's really hard to get up there and do research on them. But they migrate south every year. So if we look at the proportion of adults, which should stay relatively steady, to the proportion of young, and if it's some year where there's a much larger proportion of young, it means they had a really good breeding season. A year where it's a much smaller proportion of young, that means they had a really poor breeding season. So we can really find out a lot about these populations by just getting these birds in our hand. And of course, our data is combined. So we have the 6,000 birds we captured down at Wellfleet or at Monomoy, but then there's all the birds from Wellfleet and then the 100 other banding stations, and all of our data gets combined. So what are some of the common birds we capture down here? Some of it you would probably expect. Right down the middle of this slide, we have our 5 most common captures. So first, we have, starting at the top here, this is a savanna sparrow. It's a bird that breeds on the coastal dunes on the outer half of Cape Cod. So they're on the Atlantic side. So you would think if you've ever been out to Rays Point, these birds would be there, but they're not. For some reason, they're only out on Monomoy and the Atlantic coast. Gray catbird, a bird that many of you have in your yard, probably all of you. These are actually increasing on South Monomoy as the trees get bigger and bigger. Yellow warbler here, another very common bird that loves the marshes, and it's one of the more visible birds on Cape Cod. And then a song sparrow here, a juvenile song sparrow. So those 4 birds breed on South Monomoy, and then directly below this, these 5 stacked, those are all different pictures of common yellowthroats. It's actually a decent example of how we age these birds. So the top one is an adult male. The next 2 are young males with a little bit of black coming in on their mask. And then the bottom 2 are females, and you can't age them based upon their mask, but you can see there's a variation among the plumage here if you know what to look for. So those are the birds that breed there. We get a lot of those. And then there are the birds that winter on Cape Cod. And I mainly use these to refer to this guy right here, which is a yellow-rumped warbler. They are the most numerous bird on Cape Cod in the winter, I would think. And they are far and away the most numerous bird we capture on Monomoy. We get about 4,000 of them a year out of our maybe 6,000 total captures. It's an incredibly numerous bird. And when we started catching a lot of these, just kind of accepted it. But then, maybe it's a geography thing. But then I went and looked up the numbers on some of these birds. So these guys above them, these are Cape May warblers. There's, I think, about 7 million Cape May warblers in the world. There's 120 million yellow rumps. It's just this extremely numerous bird. So the other group we see a lot of are Caribbean-bound migrants. If you actually look at the geography, the Caribbean, if you're heading there, you would end up at Cape Cod pretty regularly. They're very coastally. So birds that winter in the Caribbean are these guys right here, Cape May warblers. Also, American redstarts, northern water thrush, and those birds that are kind of aiming for the Caribbean, we get a lot more. Many species of songbirds winter in Mexico. That's where the vast majority of them winter, and those birds end up on Cape Cod a lot less. And then there's some birds that are actually shockingly absent. So in the bottom right corner here, this blue jay, we captured our first blue jays ever on South Monomoy this fall. And we've been down there since 2011. And this year, after the series of hurricanes, tropical storms when they hit us, we were just sitting in the house. It was still too windy to band. And I saw a blue jay out the window. And we went out there and took this picture of them. And they stuck around for 3 or 4 days. We caught them. There were 2 of them. We kept capturing them over and over again. But as I said, these songbirds, they don't like crossing water. They don't want to be down there. The migrants are moving, so these types of things that happen. But blue jays, although they do migrate to an extent, aren't these long distance migrants. The other species that we have shockingly never captured on South Monomoy are black-capped chickadee and tufted titmouse. Black-capped chickadees hate crossing water. Tufted titmice are very closely related. They also do not like crossing water. Titmice have spread north in the last 60 years, so they're pretty common on Cape Cod now, one of the more common birds. Still have never made it to Nantucket, so they've never made that jump across the sound. There's chickadees, which have been on the Cape for, historically, for before people were here, there were chickadees here. But the titmice recently arrived and they have yet to make the jump over. Now the cardinals have also recently arrived, but they've been able to make it onto Nantucket. And we do get cardinals, but we've never had a chickadee. We've never had a titmouse. This was the first time we ever had a blue jay. There was one year when the island was still connected to the mainland. We had a squirrel, where we know because we saw it once, and then we saw all the chewed up pine cones, and other people saw it. But this turtle must have been at the Chatham light and got spooked and then ran down 7 miles of dune before it found the pine cones at the lighthouse. But it found the lighthouse, just like everything that ends up on the south end of the island ends up at the lighthouse, whether it be the only blue jay we've ever seen or that one squirrel. So those are like the more abundant birds that we get. And one of the most exciting things about Monomoy is the level of rarities we get. It is the rarest birds around. It is an incredible spot to catch rare birds. So we start on the bottom left here, the black-throated gray warbler. This is a dry forest nester of the western US. So these birds breed from Colorado to the west coast, winter in Mexico, but they do migrate and they end up on the Cape from time to time. So I think there's been 3 reports on the Cape in the last 5 years. 2 of them have been on South Monomoy, and the other one was on Indian Hill and Chatham. So one morning I was getting up to go to work, and I drove out of my house, and there were 35 local Cape Cod birders wandering the neighborhood looking for the black-throated gray warbler. So these, every other year, one of these shows up in Massachusetts, and we've had 2. Up here on the top left, this is a McGillivrays warbler. This is another West Coast bird. They breed from Colorado to the West Coast, winter in Mexico. We had one 2 years ago, and it was the 14th ever sighting in the state. So Massachusetts is very intense about their bird sightings. There's a state record committee. People fight to get on it and verify everything. It's really great, and they were very excited. We talked to them a lot. Townsend solitaire here in the middle, another western bird. They breed all through Mexico in the mountainous areas up through Colorado into southern Canada. And again, these are less rare. They tend to come down slope in the winter and then just kind of head east and feed on fruits and things. But we spotted this bird by our nets, and we were able to ID it and then eventually catch it. A really nice one. Our probably champion bird here is the yellow-green vireo. It's only the 2nd sighting ever in Mass, and I think it's only the 5th sighting of this species north of Florida ever. These are a lot like red-eyed vireos, except for they migrate the opposite way. So these are austral migrants. They winter throughout Mexico, and then when they go to breed, they go south into South America and then winter in Central America and Mexico. So you could see in their migration, since they're migrating birds, if their things get messed up, they might head north. It's pretty uncommon, but it is how it works. And then this one in the bottom right is a white-winged crossbill. So these are seed-eating finches of northern Canada, and on occasional years, the seed crop up north fails, and then they head south. And they usually just go south until they find the best seed crop, which means they have to go through Ontario and then Maine, and then usually at some point in that flight. They find some seed crop and some trees and they stop. But this year they made it all the way down to Cape Cod. And when these birds make it to the Cape, they're flying south and they're flying east and they end up on Monomoy. So we had 8 of these this year. And on the average year, most people don't, there's not 1 or 2 white-winged crossbills seen in the entire Cape. It's just everything ends up on South Monomoy. And that is a lot based upon how birds migrate. So young songbirds have, it's known as a watch and compass migration, but essentially they just have something in their brain. Their parents are gone. They breed, the parents leave, the young have to migrate south the first time on their own. What they do is they have this timer and compass in their head that says you need to migrate south at this direction, southeast, for 17 days. And then once you're there, then they'll hear birds that are their same species. But it's just like they have a direction and a timer and they go in that direction for that many days. Well, when off that, and that direction is south. Well, if there's something that goes wrong in their brain, because this is a very mechanical thing, especially in first years, often their compass gets whacked off by 90 degrees. So instead of going due south, they go due east or due west. And if a bird from the Rockies goes due east and then they don't want to cross the water, eventually they get funneled onto Cape Cod and then they get funneled onto South Monomoy, which is what happens. And hence we get these incredible rarities, about 1 a year. So a little bit about the statistics at the banding station, some of our overall numbers. Here's a graph of the birds that we capture. It's all about the volume, how many we capture each day. So in this part here, where it goes from October 5th to October 29th, and the numbers shoot up, that's when the yellow-rumped warblers show up. So we have, these are the local breeders, common yellow-throats, yellow warblers, song sparrows. We get all the young birds, and then eventually those birds migrate. And then this is, little puffs of migration. Some red stars come through here, something, and then the yellow rumps show up. And then it's just boom, 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 boom. And you can see it drops here at the end of the season. But if we stayed into November, we would continue to capture these birds. Some of the other things that are interesting to observe here, the number of species we observe each year, really nice and high. The number of captures we have, I don't have the caption to this graph, but our effort changed. So at the first year, we didn't band every day. We weren't there as much. You can see it's only 18 days of banding. And then towards this point, the seasons start to get a little bit longer. So these are more kind of consistent. And then the number of days we census, and then the captures per 100 hours. So this is how we standardize based upon effort. If the wind's blowing, if it's rainy, we can't open our nets. So every year we have a different number of net hours. So this bottom row is a really key one, and it shows for the effort how busy it was. 2017 looks like a real banger, but we didn't start the season until halfway through. But as you can see, we had a great year in 2020. Full effort, highest capture rate since we've restarted. But these are the kind of things, and every year I do a really extensive report. I have a 25-page report that's full of these kind of statistics. So again, that's the bird banding. So that's how we count all the songbirds. But that's only one group of birds that are using the island. So it doesn't do us any good when we're talking about shorebirds or sea ducks or marsh ducks. So we do these other counts, each one that's kind of specifically set up for the species. So Powder Hole, we stand right here where someone took the picture from, and then we just stand stationary in one spot and count all these birds. Lighthouse Bluff, we stand right on the tip of this dune and then just look out into the endless ocean. And you can see we don't count everything to every distance because you can't, but you can see there's a rip here. I think it's Bierce's Shoal that's here. I'm not positive, but there's a big shoal out there. So we go out to that, and the fishing boats are all sitting here along the shoal, and the terns are feeding, and the birds really get sucked into there. But it's really wonderful that we just sit up on this dune and just look out into the Portugal. Really, it's amazing. And then the freshwater ponds. That is often really distant scoping. You can see in the water in this picture, there's probably 100 ducks in that photo, but they're quite distant often. So Powder Hole is really a special place. It a wonderful, wonderful location for all these shorebirds. The geography's right, so they end up there, but it's also they don't get harassed there. Shorebirds, when they stop over for long periods of time. So those birds that made the jump from the Great Lakes or from northern Canada that come to the Cape, they'll actually stop here for 6 weeks and build up fat before they make a migration. Shorebirds just it's a very different geographic challenge for them. Songbird can migrate south and they don't have to aim that well because they can feed in a forest or a yard or some hedges. It may not be great, but they can figure it out. A shorebird has to be in a shallow water area that has enough water movement that it's actually has invertebrates that can find food. So what they do is they make these giant jumps while they'll fly for 3 days straight, and then they'll come to the Cape, and then they'll spend 6 weeks here. And then once they leave here, they'll fly nonstop to Suriname or Venezuela or wherever they're going. So the fact that they can come down to Monomoy and they can go to Powder Hole and feed for an entire tidal cycle without getting flushed, and then just go into the dunes and roost there. South Monomoy hosts the birds that the whimbrels that feed every day at Wellfleet Bay will come down and winter on or overnight and sleep on South Monomoy. So it's incredibly important for all those birds. Terns are another one. So pretty much all the terns in the Northeast, which essentially are made up of three species: common terns, roseate terns, and least terns, all stage on the outer Cape before they migrate. So they finish breeding in Connecticut and Maine and Massachusetts and all these places, but then they all move to the outer Cape between Monomoy and Race Point for a month and a half in the fall, and all they do is feed. The young sit on the beach, the adults go out to feed, bring back in the food, and this is where they put on all their weight for migration. So when we go to Powder Hole in late August, there's 500 terns sitting on there. And we've learned how to identify the roseate tern, often because they're the ones that have a bunch of colored bands on their legs, so the researchers can ID them. But we also see sandwich terns, the occasional Arctic tern. And this is really just like this amazing stationary count where we set up our scope and then we just go from one end to another, counting the birds as we go. The average number of some of these, we see 145 black-bellied plovers every time, but sometimes we see 400. The gulls are always there. The cormorants are always there. With these huge flocks of snowy egrets. And then really good for rare birds. Last fall, we had, I think, Hudsonian godwits about 15 different times. Again, probably the same birds, but we had 4 different marble godwits, little blue heron, which is an increasing rarity on the Cape. We had our first one this year. And then this is shorebird ID. So if you look at this little brown shorebird here, that's a semi-palmated plover, I think. But there's also a European species called a common ring plover that's almost identical, except for like the amount of white over the bill and the eye ring and the toes. Like there's all these little minor things that these incredible birders come down here and able to figure it out. But we want to make sure that our counts are the most useful. So this is a stationary count. We count every bird that's down there, and we follow Monument's shorebird survey protocol. So that way, our survey data is just another contribution to this incredibly large project that stretches across the Americas. because we're taking this data and we want it to be as useful to as many people as possible. And yeah, powder hole's fun. So you go down there and you're hanging out and you're counting your birds. And then all of a sudden, every bird in the entire mudflat takes up. And that's when you know you got to look for that peregrine falcon. Then you see the falcon come swooping in and all the birds flush. And then yeah, we've yet to see it catch one, but we're always kind of hoping for that. But then they get away. Or one day we showed up and there was a peregrine falcon sitting in the middle of the mudflat, just chomping down on some shorebird it had captured. And the other birds were feeding, but nobody was within about 50 meters of that peregrine falcon. Everybody kind of like getting on with their lives watching them. But it is a really cool place where just like all this cool bird stuff happens. So we survey that every 2 days. And then, sorry, this is the Lighthouse Bluff.
And then we got a bag at home. I think
which
they're in the dresser by the spiral.
it's supposed to be a moving video here, but it's not, doesn't seem to be playing, but that's okay. So this is hard to see here. This is us on the dune looking out. There are thousands and thousands of sea ducks here. Oh, so yeah, there's a good count for us is 10 to 15,000 sea ducks. And see if I can get this to work. Oh well. So he's got a common eider here in the corner, but these birds feed on, there's this massive bed of mussels out here, and these birds feed on the mussels. They dive down to, it's not that deep out there, maybe 30 feet, rip up the mussels, bring them up to the top and eat them. And what happens is the tide's always moving. So as they dive, the tide pushes them south or north, and then they have to cycle back. So after they travel over the entire mussel bed, then they fly back north. So we just see this incredible thing where it's thousands and thousands and thousands of sea ducks cycling over these mussel beds. And this is the mussel bed that caused so much kind of friction between the town and the refuge. So the town or the refuge, when they put in new rules about the refuge, one of the things they said it up so there could be no dredging of the mussel beds in the future. So that got misconstrued as no collecting clams on the what is it called, the common flats. Well, that's not what it was. The common flats were always open. They will always be open. They're protected in perpetuity. They're older than the refuge itself. But these mussel beds, they're trying to protect from dredgers coming and just dredging up the mussel beds that could potentially happen in the future. And they're incredibly valuable to these birds. I mean, there's thousands, 20,000 birds that are feeding on these mussels during migration. And it's just wonderful to catch them. Capture them. This is a beautiful evening shot. We usually try to do this survey at like 4 p.m. So we just have these incredible colors over the ocean. And it shows the sea ducks down here, but we also get really cool. This is where we see shearwaters and Jaegers and these beautiful offshore pelagic birds, the occasional razorbill, which is like a little penguin that can fly. You'll see them flying by here from time to time. It's a really, really beautiful spot that has these counts that are just kind of staggering. Nobody expected there to be that many of them out there. And then the freshwater pond census. So this is essentially a duck count. We do see things like gallinules. Common gallinules breed in one place in Massachusetts. It's on South Monomoy, but it's mainly ducks. So we walk this red path, and then there's all these places where we climb up on a dune, look at this body of water, and then we come here and climb up on this dune and look at this and this and this and look at this and this, and then eventually make it over here to Big Station. And I don't have a lot of good photos of this because this is usually what the birds look like. They're distant through the scope, and ducks are in their breeding plumage for 10 months out of the year. So they actually, like a mallard, the male becomes that beautiful green head in the winter, usually in about November, and then they'll find a mate at that point and migrate north. But from August until late October is the only time of the year when they're not in the breeding plumage. So the mallards are brown and the gadwalls are brown and the black ducks are brown and the pintails are brown and everybody's brown. So we have to do all this ID based upon the shape of the bird and the shape of the bill. And it's really rewarding, but it's really difficult and it's very hard to capture in an image. Like this one, here's a scope shot of a greater yellow legs feeding in the marsh here. But again, these are the largest numbers of ducks anywhere in Eastern Mass. Um, every time I enter these birds on eBird, eBird will, it's a wonderful program. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. Essentially, if you go birding, you can enter all your sightings into it from this place you're at, and then that contributes to research. It's a big Cornell project, but it has all these filters that will flag things that it thinks are rare. So you don't make a mistake, and then you just have to explain why. So when I enter into eBird, this gadwall gets flagged, ringneck duck gets flagged, ruddy duck gets flagged, shoveler, pintail, high-billed grebe, green-winged teal, blue-winged teal, widgeon, and wood duck usually not, but it considers every one of these birds to be rare on the Cape, and we get every one of those birds on every single one. And so our explanation in Monomoy, but it's just we're in this kind of place that really is just it's really special and doesn't have other stuff. It's incredibly valuable location, and we try to do everything we can to count as many of the different groups of birds down there. So that's a lot of the research that we do. We also live in the lighthouse, and that's always kind of an interesting thing. I'll move through this stuff a little quicker so we'll have a time for some questions. But here we are at the boat ledge at Stage Harbor, waiting to load everything into the boat. Here we are after we got dropped up on South Monomoy, sometimes with help, sometimes just dropped off with the two of us to carry all the stuff across. It's only about a half a mile across the island, but it gets tiring. Here's the new fridge that we're very excited about. The house itself only got solar a couple of years ago, but we have an actual fridge with 20 days worth of food. Here's our cupboard. Lots and lots of delicious canned foods, but we fill this up when we get there. Here's the bed where I spend the season with my wife, Val, who also helps us run it. It's hard to see, but that bluff right there through the window is where we do our pelagic sea or our sea watch from. So on really stormy days, you can actually sit with your scope and look out the window and see the sea ducks during the storm. And then sunset through the window, of course, every day. Stop in the middle of dinner to look at the sunset. We do have to do some office work from time to time. So here is a computer using a Wi-Fi hotspot. This is actually Val having a meeting with multiple people that have like normal business jobs. Fishing when possible, a nice bluefish. We wish we could catch more bluefish. We endlessly catch illegally small bass that we have to release. But on a good day, we get a bluefish and then we get to take it home and eat it. And here is Val having a wonderful breakfast at the banding station, looking out over the marsh before the day gets busy. And then, of course, the view from the deck in the lighthouse. This is a panorama photo, so it actually covers more than it looks like. This is the wonderful deck where we just sit out and look at this stuff all day. It's really incredible out there. And the lighthouse, it really has been upgraded. You can see the solar panels here. So when I first started in 2011, they were using the recovery funds to just kind of secure the house. The house was in really terrible condition. The windows were busted out. The shingles were all gone. So they secured it and they installed a pit toilet. And then eventually it took years of a refuge manager leaving, the new refugee manager coming in and then going, no, I got to finish this project. So they put the deck on, they installed the solar. There's power in every room. We used to have to use the old school like pump that you'd see it like when you're camping with the red handle. Now there's a faucet and a water filter and a propane stove. There's technically heat and AC, but never use it. I mean, you live on the island, you close the windows, stays warm. You open the windows, it gets cool. But they've really done amazing things to that house. And there's researchers in there 10 months out of the year, I believe. So it's really nice that they use it. Um, and this is a really a small independent nonprofit. It's all run through local support. All the funding we get goes directly to the experienced banders, the equipment, and the food. Fish and Wildlife supplies housing, they supply boat transport, and they supply the nets. Um, Everything else that we pay for out of pocket, unless we can end up raising the money for it. But it's important work. We love it. We love to come out here and just sit and watch these. These are giant flocks of tree swallows. Another really common bird out there that we're hoping to start a project with, but it's just a really independent project. And it's local funding and it supports local conservation, but it does have a global impact. These birds go all the way down to Central America. They go all the way to Northern Canada. Our data is combined with all the other bird banders across the continent. So it is a small project that does impact everything. And if you're interested in becoming involved, there's any number of ways you can do it. You can support the project directly. You can also follow us on eBird and Instagram. Bird banding lends itself wonderfully to Instagram. We get amazing birds every day, and we just quickly take a really close-up pic of it and let it go. It takes 5 or 10 seconds. But then we get to share these birds with people, which is incredibly important. We're trying to save these animals. If we just live on some isolated island and enjoy the birds, well, that's great for me, but we really do want to like connect people with these animals. So we do that outreach as much as we can. Come and attend a demo at Wellfleet Bay every spring and fall from April through early June, and in the fall from September through mid-November. Every Friday we have public demos. Get up close, just like this. Come see me holding this bluebird just like that. Choose native plants. This is a big one that we're learning a lot more about is birds need insects and insects need native plants. So if you're making a choice for landscaping, choose native. The Friends of Monomoy is the nonprofit branch of Monomoy. It's a good group. They do a lot of good projects down there. You can definitely get in touch with them. And they do a turn census on South Monomoy, or on the north end of South Monomoy every year in June, where they have 30 volunteers. You go out to the island and you actually just walk through the tern colony. It's very well arranged. Everybody's on a rope. You watch your feet. It's this whole thing, but you get to walk through the tern colony and help them count all the nests. So you're walking shoulder to shoulder with 10 other people. And when there's a nest in front of you, you just say, count the number of eggs in it and shout it out and they write it down. But it's really cool. That's where this video of the terns came from. So this, which is probably, it's not going to play now, but that's where that's from. So that's a really good way to join, and they do need people, and it is a really amazing experience. And you can always just go to the website and learn more. But yeah, it's a wonderful place. We feel very lucky to be there. We work hard to make it happen, but it's been a real eye opener to us. Like, we figured there'd be birds out there, and there was a man named Jim Baird who banded down there in the 70s, and he got really good birds too. But the volume that we've actually encountered, as far as songbirds goes, was a real surprise for Fish and Wildlife, so much that they realized that there was a gap in the radar, and the radar wasn't showing any birds down there, and they've actually added additional radar to start covering that area because it's so important for migration. And we feel like we're kind of, that's partially due to us. We're not the reason they're migrating, and we're not the reason the refuge's there, but counting these birds and letting people know about it's really important. And that brings me to the end of the prepared part. I can definitely take some questions now.
Thank you
Okay,
so
it's
much, James.
yeah.
This has been really, as I said at the beginning, I don't think so many people know about this really important work that's happening right here in Chatham. And as you say, has a real global dimension to it. And so, just really happy to have you introduce us to what you're doing.
Yeah,
So,
Monomoy is like this secret gem in town. It's just so hard to get down there, but everybody who
right.
does is like, oh my God, everybody feels like a connection to the place. The number of people we run into that are like, oh, I've been coming here, or I haven't been here in 30 years. I feel like this is my place. Like, and I love it. It's just such a special spot for that.
Hi,
So
James. I was going to say, Ellen, hi, James. This is Lauren. There's a couple of questions in our chat. And how
Yeah, I
many?
see those.
Okay, great.
So we run 16 mist nets on South Monomoy, which is not a lot. We run 24 at Wellfleet and we catch way fewer birds. And they are essentially in the marshy sections with trees adjacent to the ponds. So it's kind of about like there's some willows and there's some pitch pines, and we try to get like tucked down as low as possible into the marshy areas with the wind. And then of course it floods and we can't operate the nets, but where the habitat is not that diverse. So it's essentially a combination of willows and conifers and like weird other little bushes. There's some phragmites and things down there, but it's just these generic little patches of trees. And yeah, 12 nets, which is not a lot. And we've thought about moving into other habitats out there, but the wind is just such an issue that we are tucked into where we can tuck in because it's the only place we can actually run the nets. Now, we've been very lucky that I'm not sure about the habitat on the island before I got there. I see old pictures and I see what it looks like now, but in the time that we've been there, the trees and the willows have actually grown up significantly. So there are views across the island have changed. Things we used to be able to see, we can't see. And it's incredibly beneficial to us because the more trees there are, the more our nets are protected, but it actually changes out there slightly. As far as banding at long pasture, well, it's always something we're interested in, but it's all about funding and personnel. And we would also love to do banding at Tom's Neck, which I think geographically is an incredible spot for building up birds. But it's always just kind of, I'm already running 2, love to run 5. And then as far as birding trips down to South Monomoy, that is always an issue. Fish and Wildlife does occasional trips down there, but the boat always fills up like that. Wellfleet used to do it, but then the difficulty of finding somebody who is allowed to land on the island and has a boat that can hold enough people to pay for it. It's like a whole thing. So that makes it's always made it an issue. Wellfleet just gave up on it. There's one guy that does trips down there, Keith at the Rip Rider, but Keith got injured last year, and we don't know if the Rip Rider is going to be going. It becomes this whole thing. The best thing to do is just find somebody with a boat to get down there. It's a real bummer because it's an incredible place, but it's just so hard to organize those trips. Yeah, the tiger beetle thing. That's not my research per se, but the idea is that there are other tiger beetles that live there, and it's technically not native, but they are trying to save the species, so they put them there. Like, again, it's not my thing. I'm sure that their justification for it is very strong, but I think overall it is. These tiger beetles often form the same kind of service in the ecosystem, and there are other species of tiger beetles out there, so introducing this additional one isn't going to mess up the ecosystem, but again, it's not my thing. There's always a mortality rate with mist nets. It really varies hugely based upon the operator. And things are monitored pretty closely now. I would imagine it's safer now just because things are monitored in a way and we're much better at sharing information about best practices. So they used to ban birds at Wellfleet Bay back when it was the Austin Sanctuary. They started banning there in the 30s. The first use of mist nets for research in North America. And they would set up the nets in the evening, leave them up all night and check them in the morning. So those birds were potentially in the nets for 12 hours and well, maybe less, but still 6. And I mean, that's shocking to me. And they didn't have a lot of mortalities. They also killed every single animal that could ever possibly kill a bird. So you see all these notes, kill the snake today, kill the fox, kill the snake, kill the fox. But yeah, I think the our mortality is less than 0.5%. So we're about 1 every 500 birds. And there's mortalities associated with this. It's a bummer. Let's see. So we have not had a Western tanager on South Monomoy. It's a really good Cape Cod bird. We're still hoping. We have had scarlets and summers, but we always hope for Western, but that's a place for them. We haven't had the painted buntings that people tend to get. The color of the bands are they're flagged, so there's a couple different things they can indicate. If they have a number on them, that means it's a unique combination for that bird, so you're able to spot it anywhere in the world. So you see this on ducks a lot, and you see it on shorebirds. But often if it's just a combination of color bands, it's just to indicate an individual when they're within the colony. So they get in there and they flag the chicks, and then they can tell the chicks from the other chicks in the colony. But the colors are there to indicate individuals. We do it with pine warblers also, and each bird gets 4 bands, 2 on each leg. And we have 7 different colors, and with those 7 different colors, including the silver band, there's 1,000 different combinations, but it allows you to identify the bird without getting it in your hand. That's the answer. You can see it, you can ID it, you don't have to get it back in your hand, which is incredibly valuable. And then a lot of these birds, we had the first birds that show up in Montreal in the spring are the ring-billed gulls, which is not everybody's favorite bird, but they're the first ones that show up here, so I like them. We were like hanging out in the park with our friends last year, and I looked over and there was a bird that had a field readable band on its leg. It was like eating trash at a park. And I looked it up, and it was like a 15-year-old ring-billed gull that they had banded as a young bird on a colony down the road. So it's definitely those flags are really important. And if you ever see a shorebird with any kind of bands on it or a tern, try to get pics, try to see what the number is. It's hard without really good optics, but sometimes they're really close. And I've had birds that did not like it. She's, oh, look, a sanderling. No big deal. There's thousands of sanderlings. And then you upload it and they're like, that was a bird that was banded 4 years ago in Belize and nobody's seen it since then. So any of that, anytime you see a bird with readable, they're really, really valuable to the researchers. And I've been shocked at finding stuff that nobody's seen in years. Yeah, that's a great question.
I'm just going to take the next question. Paul asked about whether this webinar would be available if there's a recording being made. Yes, there is. That will be posted on the CCF website in the next few weeks. And we'll also be sending you a copy of the slide deck for this. So anybody who's registered will get the slide deck, and the recording will be coming later. So people are typing in questions in the chat box, or
Perfect.
just speak out. So we have a couple more here.
Yeah, the sea ducks are really intimidating. They're huge numbers. They're actually not as challenging to count as those stupid tree swallows are, but there's some few techniques for that. What we do is we'll start by looking at a chunk of birds and say, all right, that's 20. So then you count them in 20s for a little bit, and then you jump up to 100. And then you start counting in chunks of 100. And with the sea ducks, what we'll do is we'll go through and we'll count in chunks of 100 or raise it up. And there's difficulties with all of this because of the way perception works. There's twice as many birds in the next row back as the birds in the front and all these things. Cornell talks about this, but we count them in chunks of 100, and then we tend to break them up by the species. So if we have 4,000 birds, we'll be like, all right, well, you look at all of that, 2,000 of those were eider, 1,000 of them were white wing, 700. And that's really the only way you can do it. But the thing is, if you're counting by hundreds and you're dealing with thousands of birds, your level of accuracy is about as good as it really needs to be. The tree swallows, though, I mean, that's this whole other challenge where, because they're swirling, at least the ducks are generally sitting there or going in one direction. The tree swallows are swirling and swirling. And so we get these counts of 5,000, but it could have been 8, it could have been 3. And really, some of this is really challenging. If you see a band number on a bird, you just go to reportband.gov. And then it has a whole thing about filling it in.
And what about crow predation on the piping plovers?
Yeah, I don't do the piping plovers, but I know how they deal with crow predation. They have an actual game control hunter that goes out there. So he's a professional hunter that's paid by Fish and Wildlife. And he goes out there with his 5 scary dogs, and they live in kennels, and these are not pets. And he shoots every crow. He catches every grackle and traps, or shoots every grackle. And then they use the dogs to catch the coyotes, which is apparently a brutal process. And that's how they deal with it. So they get out there and they control the predators. There's no crows in the summer on Monomoy. Every year, 1 or 2 shows up in the fall, and you can tell they're like, oh man, I dispersed on this young crow and I found this great breeding area where nobody else is. And then spring comes along and bang. So yeah, it's a bummer, but it's more about the terns. There are 12,000 pairs of terns on that island, and a couple major predation events. No animal could ever eat all the terns, but they could cause them to abandon. And right now there's a giant protective colony on a national wildlife refuge where they can control it and protect it. But those birds could decide they're going to go nest up on Nauset or in South Chatham on like the beach there. And then all of a sudden you have 12,000 terns in an area where they can't control them. So yeah, that's how they deal with I don't think they even cage the nest down there for the plovers. I think they just kind of let it go. But again, that's not my research, so I don't know that much about it.
I was just going to say, is there anybody who just wants to unmute themselves and ask a quick question here? Been taking questions from the chat box, but is there anybody who wants to? Oh, okay.
I can answer this one in the chat box here. Yeah, I think that storms are the main thing that accounts for western birds being blown out, but usually it is there's a genetic issue. It's almost always young birds, because adult birds have actually made the trip, and when they make the trip south and north, they build a map in their head so they can correct themselves in the future. But the young birds don't have that map. There's no way for them to know if they're in the wrong place, or their brain just says go in this direction for this many nights and then stop. And they stop because the adults migrate first. So the young birds get down south, and then they hear their species and they know that's where they stop. And they just get messed. There's just like they get messed up. And then there's of course storms in the ocean and shorebirds and incredible winds in Europe that lead to fallout in Newfoundland. Like there's all these crazy things, but it is often storm related. And when it comes to something being on the other side of the continent, there's usually a genetic, something's wrong with their brain. That's talking about songbirds. I mean, like other birds, shorebirds travel great distances, and there's all kinds of other things for other birds.
Great. Any last questions from anybody? Okay. Oh, here we go. One more.
The only woodpeckers that migrate are northern flickers. So we get more northern flickers in the winter. Every other species of woodpecker that sapsuckers and flickers migrate. The rest of them are there all year. Oh, good. I'm glad that information was helpful. You can always contact me too through Mass Audubon. I could provide some more. Definitely. We do a lot of, well, you probably do it a lot too, so I could get some information from you. All right, great.
Right.
You're all very welcome. I was really glad to get to talk. I mean, Monomoy is, I'm just like everybody else. Like, I'm not a spiritual person, but I really love that place. I feel like such a connection to it. So I'm always happy to talk about it.
Well, thank you, James, so much. And thanks all of you. Definitely you'll be able to, see James up close and personal at the Wellfleet Bay banding workshops later in the year for sure. And we're hoping to bring James back to do a trail walk for us later in the summer. So keep on the lookout for that. Also, as I say, we have 3 more webinars coming up next week at the same time. We'll have local naturalist Todd Kelly, who'll be talking about tracking land mammals in this area. So please, just keep in touch with the foundation and look at our activities. We'll be posting all of our summer walks very shortly. So, James, thank you again, and thanks to everybody that participated. And we'll hope to see each other all again sometime soon. In the meantime, have a very nice weekend.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen, and all of you, everybody. Yeah, have a great weekend. Enjoy winter while it's still out there.
Thanks again.
Yeah.